Welcome back to Diversitas. Diversitas is a podcast at the crossroads of diversity, business, and culture. Today we have a man who is really, I would not be a lawyer, quite honestly, without this dude who has been in my life since I was in my late 20s. Today we have Carl Singley. Carl Singley is currently counsel to the firm of the Tucker Law Group, but he is much, much more than that. He is a dean of the Philadelphia Bar. He is a former law professor. He's a former dean of Temple University Law School when there weren't that many deans of law schools that look like Carl, not that there are that many now. He was the founder of one of the preeminent, if not the preeminent, as a matter of fact, I'm going to correct myself. He was the founder of the preeminent African-American law firm in the late 80s up until probably 2000, Singley, Potts, and Booth. He served on any number of boards and commissions. In other words, this is a great man that we're talking to today. And so I am very, very appreciative that he has given us a little bit of his time. Carl Singley, welcome today, sir.
Good morning, Michael. Good to see you, man.
How are you?
I'm fine. Fantastic, actually.
Awesome. Thank you for joining us. So let's start off with this. Why don't you just tell the audience kind of what you are doing these days? What's taking up your time?
Well, I am largely retired, spending my time between Florida, the Tampa Bay area, and the Pocono Mountains that we like to spend the summers in. And I continue to be, as I have been actually since 1984, counsel to the Tucker Law Group. And a part of what I do there is I advise lawyers on appellate matters, on briefs. I don't go to court, not interested in doing that. And worked last year on a fairly significant project, which was an independent investigation into the use and possession of moved remains at the Penn Museum. And so I directed an independent inquiry as to how those remains managed to come from Osage Avenue in 1985.
Right.
After the horrific killing by the city of Philadelphia of 11 men, women, and children in what was essentially a bombing in a neighborhood, and how they ended up being used 35 years ago, some of the remains.
That was kind of full circle for you, right? Weren't you involved in the original move commission?
Well, actually I was. In 1985, I was special counsel to the Move Commission that looked at the original couple of episodes, 1978 and 1985. So I guess that's an example of the past as prologue. But
right.
35 years later, the specter of that disaster still haunts the city of Philadelphia and its reputation.
There's no question. Speaking of the past as prologue, you know, it's no coincidence, I would think, that you kind of wound up with Joe Tucker. Why don't you tell the audience about kind of your history helping Joe with his firm?
Well, I've been fortunate in the sense that first part of my career, I was largely an academic, a teacher and a law dean and an associate dean and the like. And then in 1987, I started my own law firm that for most of its time in existence was called Singley and Associates. So in 2000, the year 2000, I decided to merge my firm with a firm that I'm sure you know about, Mike, called the Blank Rome firm.
Yes.
And a couple of my partners at the time, Chris Booth and Barbara Potts went to Blank Rome with me. Chris Booth decided to stay in the facilities that I was vacating.
Right.
I left my furniture, a few cases, some clients, and my telephone number in that location on South Broad Street. And Joe Tucker subsequently, shortly thereafter, joined Chris Booth, and they formed a law partnership that was called Booth and Tucker that lasted 5 or 6 years.
Right.
And so in a sense, that the Tucker group had some of its origins in the old space that I used to have on South Broad Street. And today, by the way, the office phone number is still the number
Is
that
that right?
yeah, years ago.
That's hilarious.
Yeah.
So, it's interesting you bring up Blank Rome. I know when you left uh, your firm, or I can say you merged your firm, I should say, with Blank Rome, and that's where I met you. I met you while I was an associate at Blank Rome, and I remember being an associate at Blank Rome and just absolutely hating the practice of law, just hating it, hating being in big firm culture, hating just not, I didn't like the work. I didn't feel like I was very good at it. And you helped me in that particular period of my life because I was thinking about leaving the practice of law altogether. And so it kind of brings me to the point because I know that you've mentored many people, many attorneys of color. When you kind of deal with younger attorneys of color, right, particularly in the large firm context, let's start there. Is there any advice that you give to them as they are kind of going through kind of the journey that can oftentimes be a lonely journey?
Well, first of all, let me tell you, probably how I would describe your reaction at the time was sort of a restlessness, uh,
Mm,
sort of an impatience with the process. You understood too that it was mundane tasks, repetitious tasks. And I don't know whether your listeners or viewers know it or not, but you have a master's degree in addition to a law degree. So that suggested that you had intellectual interests that went beyond the pure practice of law, which I don't think anybody claims is an intellectual pursuit.
correct.
So I think what you were trying to do at that time was reconcile, those two parts of your background and your education. And I think the lesson from that is that young lawyers ought to have interests that go beyond the law.
Mm,
Because for the most part, what we do is largely unexciting and boring as hell, although very lucrative. So you need an outlet. So so to the extent that you have professional training that goes beyond the law, there's no reason why you shouldn't complement what you're doing as a lawyer with your other intellectual and outside pursuits. And I think that allows you to have balance and perhaps feel the way that I felt. I've never had a day that I regretted being a lawyer.
mm,
Never has been a day. I've had some good times, some bad times as a lawyer, worked with a couple of law firms. You and I met at the CRD bankruptcy. I mean, not met, but we worked at
right,
the CRD bankruptcy firm for a
right,
while.
right.
And so I've worked in big firms, two big firms, three small firms. And there's never been a day that I regretted being a lawyer.
Well, the thing I will say about you, Carl, that I can't say about everybody, though, and I certainly can't say it about me at that period of my life, is that you always, you've always come across as your authentic self, right? You've always been where in whatever environment that you've been in. It's not to say that you don't change tone depending on who you're talking to. If you're at a board meeting, which I've seen you at many board meetings, if you're, talking to a client, if you're talking to an attorney opposing you on a particular issue, I mean, those are all kind of different situations, different contexts, but you've always been you. And I think that um, number one, it speaks well of you, but it also, I think, helps you in terms of your journey because a lot of times, and I can just speak for myself and people who I know who've been through this kind of journey, is that they oftentimes find themselves in these different environments and they believe that they have to change themselves in some way to conform to the environment that they find themselves in so that they can be successful.
Yeah.
And I think that they do themselves a disservice when that happens.
Yeah. Well, I guess what you described for me has been a blessing and a curse.
Well,
It has
true.
had mixed results. Um, I like to look back and say I have no regrets about being who I am. And I think it has a lot to do with the fact that ever since I graduated from high school in Alabama, where almost none of the guys who I grew up with ever went to college or finished. So my philosophy has been, I've been playing with house money ever since I graduated from high school. The odds were against me. And I look back and think that there was really no difference between me and those guys that didn't make it other than circumstance. Certainly a lot of them were much brighter and perhaps more deserving than I was. So I never thought somehow that because I had the ability to be a lawyer and have these various positions, that I was somehow entitled and more deserving than others. So once you kind of have the view that I wasn't even supposed to be here, then, that I think that in my mind drives my approach. And like I said, it's a blessing and a curse. And very quickly, to your point about the expectation about how you behave in certain settings. When I became the dean of the law school, I was 33 years old. 36 years old. The first African-American dean of the law school, the first Black dean of the law school, and the first Temple grad who was the dean of the law school. And I was not the first choice of the president, Peter Leokouris, who suggested that I not seek the deanship, but instead accept a position, and I'm going to come back to this, in his administration, because he was then the president, as vice president for urban affairs at Temple. And I said, no, man, I don't know nothing about no urban affairs. I'm a lawyer. I want to be a lawyer. I'm going to be the dean, or I'm just going to be a law teacher. But one of the things that I did is I had a white Porsche, Mike, because I always liked a white Porsche. Needless to say, that was completely out of character for somebody who's supposed to be the dean of the law school. And so all kind of comments were made behind my back that I must have been selling drugs or something like that. So my point is, I decided that for every day that I was in that job, however long it lasted, and it lasted for 4 years, that I was going to be who I was, and I was going to do it my way. And I tell you, I have no regrets.
So let's talk a little bit about your journey from Talladega to Yale. Let's start with Talladega first. Like, how did you get there?
Well, the reason that I left, there's a woman named Carrie McRae. Mae Graham Anderson is her name. I went to what we used to euphemistically call a boarding school in South Alabama, but it really was closer to a reform school because I got kicked out of my high school in Birmingham, which was a segregated high school called Winona in Jefferson County that was 15 miles away from my neighborhood. And I was bused past white high schools to go to my Black high school in Birmingham, which was one of the largest in the city of Birmingham. And I got kicked out because I deserved to be kicked out. I did bad things. And so I ended up at this place called Southern Normal, which was founded by a disciple of Booker T. Washington, who founded Tuskegee Institute based on the same principles.
Right.
And there was an advisor there named Mae Graham Anderson, who went to Talladega. And she identified 4 of the students who had sort of rehabilitated themselves, because kids came from all around the country who were problem kids. They used to call us juvenile delinquents back then. And she promoted Talladega College. And the only colleges I had ever heard of at that time was Howard and the University of Alabama that was racially segregated. So Talladega was a new name, which happened to be just 60 miles from my hometown. That's how we all ended up there. And then I graduated from Talladega. And then I went into an early diversity program, which was the Clio program at Emory Law School in the summer of 1960.
I think Clio still exists, by the way.
It does. It was called the Counsel on Legal Education.
Yes.
And that was an early effort to integrate the legal profession. And there were 4 of these institutes around the country, UCLA, I think, Georgetown, Emory in Atlanta, a couple of other people. So a lot of us got our start in the legal profession through this early effort. It wasn't called diversity, wasn't called affirmative action back then. It certainly wasn't called equity and inclusion. And so I ended up being recruited to come to Temple by Peter Leokouras, who at the time was an associate professor.
Interesting.
So 10 of us who were in that CLEO program in Atlanta in 1968 were recruited to come to Temple. And we came from different historically Black colleges, and that's how we got to Temple. And when we got there, there were 2 Black law students out of 800 students in the school. So the 10 of us effectively integrated the law school. And then after that, and I don't want to spend the time talking a whole lot about that,
sure.
But I ended up, after graduating from law school at Peter's encouragement, going to Yale and doing graduate work. And one of the people that I played basketball with, lived on the same floor with, and got to know was Clarence Thomas. And if you want to talk about that later, we can, but let's
okay.
Your agenda.
Well.
And by the way, let me just tell you, my first job after graduate school at Yale is I ran a program at Temple also devoted to diversity called the SPACE program. The Special Awards Committee Experiment Program was what it was called. And that program was again aimed at recruiting Black students to Temple Law School, one of whom was Augusta Clark, former councilwoman, and John Street, somebody that's well known to most people.
Right. So that dovetails nicely into what I want to talk about with you specifically, because I know, given your personal history, given the positions that you've had, given the fact that, number one, you were Dean of Temple Law School. Number two, you were the head of and the founder of a Black firm trying to do business in the city of Philadelphia, successfully doing business in the city of Philadelphia. And then you've been on numerous boards. I remember, obviously, when you were on the board of the Pennsylvania Convention Center Authority, you were part of hearings held by the city of Philadelphia addressing the need for more diversity in terms of workforce and enterprise with a number of projects. But I think the spotlight at that point was on the Pennsylvania Convention Center Authority expansion. So you have a great deal of experience and really, historical knowledge as it relates to this whole thing that is now called DEI. So what's your take on kind of where we are with this whole DEI piece?
Well, give me a moment to kind of just tell you a little bit about sort of my odyssey in the world of diversity and inclusion.
Odyssey is a special word, by the way.
That's why
That's an inside joke.
But so in addition to being the beneficiary of by coming to law school, I never would have gotten in law school but for that early example of diversity, equity, and inclusion, which was the CLEO program. Mm-hmm. And then one of my first full-time job was, in addition to being an assistant professor, was recruiting minority students to come to the law school. And then one of my other jobs is I worked as first deputy city solicitor in the Green administration. And during that time, that was in the early 80s. And during that time, there was all of the talk about set-asides and inclusion in, hiring minorities to do contracting work as well as in employment. So I wrote what later became the Minority Business Enterprises Commission.
Interesting.
During the Green administration. And Lucian Blackwell, the councilman, Augusta Clark, Joan Spector, and John Street, and several people were vigorously advocating that a certain number of percentage of contracts and jobs go to minorities in Philadelphia. Mm-hmm. And so I drafted the initial legislation that created it. And then, very briefly, then Mayor Bill Green who really didn't know who I was. I was first deputy city solicitor in Alan Davis's office. So he invited me over to his office out of the clear blue sky. Somebody said, the mayor would like to see you. And so I go into his office and he says, "Why are you pushing this affirmative action bill?"
Mm.
And he said, "Because that'll help Lucian, who ran against him." And I looked at him and said, "Do you really think that I'm," and he said, "Are you trying to help Lucian?" I said, "No, Mr. Mayor, I'm trying to help Black people.
Mm.
Why is it Black people can't get jobs in this town?"
Mm.
Right? And so he then thought long and hard about it. And then he said, "Well, I think that the ordinance that you're recommending is unconstitutional." And I'm sitting in his office, it's me, nobody else. He has not a sheet of paper on his desk. And he says to me, "I think it's," he was a lawyer, by the way, but never.
Mhm.
So he said, "I think your ordinance is unconstitutional." And I gave him a memo that was 90 pages long that I had written as the legal justification. And I said to him, "So why don't you tell me what in my legal memo you disagree with that you believe is unconstitutional?" And he couldn't point to a single sentence. He had not read it.
Of course he had.
But the interesting thing is he vetoed the bill. Counsel passed the bill creating the ordinance, and he vetoed the bill. Counsel voted to override the bill. So now I forget what it's called now, but that entity was called the Minority Business Enterprises.
Yeah, right. It changed over at some point after Streets administration.
So, but the fact of the matter is there was resistance and hostility because they were then the term preferential treatment, reverse discrimination were terms that were emerging in response to the efforts of Black people to be included, to be diverse, to seek equity. So you had these kind of counter arguments that, it's going to exclude Jews unfairly. It's going to exclude Asians unfairly. So these arguments we're hearing right now are not new to me.
No.
Quickly, I then ironically served on another committee that Bill Green appointed, which was affirmative action in the Philadelphia Police Department, where we looked at all kinds of artificial barriers, testing, physical requirements that had the impact of excluding qualified women and minorities. So I know that's a little bit off the track, but I say that to say I've watched this notion of inclusion of Black people in the economic and other benefits of this country since I was a law student. And I've seen how the names have changed. I've seen, but the more things change, the more they
stay the same. The more they stay the same.
The nomenclature has changed, but the justification and most importantly, the need for these efforts at inclusion have not changed.
No, it's interesting. I mean, as you were talking, I had a couple of questions. One is that, I am here in Philadelphia. Obviously, you have a tremendous amount of history in Philadelphia. Philadelphia, to me, is a very conservative political culture. And as much lip service as we give to, diversity, et cetera, it's still, to me, somewhat resistant to really leaning into trying to provide as much opportunity for people of color and firms of color in the city. I mean, I know that you go back and forth between here and in Florida. What's your thought on that?
Well, I think your assessment about Philadelphia is accurate, but I also think that it's not unique. Philadelphia really isn't any different, and in a more global sense. When I commented that where I am, I wasn't supposed to be here, but don't you understand that Black people were not supposed to be in position of power in this country? It was never the plan. From the time that we were afraid, and I know Juneteenth is coming up in a week or two, it has to be clear that even Abraham Lincoln never assumed that after the slaves were emancipated, that we would ever be treated as equal citizens in the society and enjoying all of the benefits.
I think he explicitly stated that that wasn't going to be the case.
If I could save the Union without freeing any slaves, I would do so.
That's right.
If I could free the Union, save the Union by freeing some slaves and not others, I would do so.
Right.
But there's a pattern all the way up to the present time in which there has been a resistance to treating African Americans, Black people, Negroes, whatever you prefer to call us, as full citizens in this country. And the way it works, it has, first we get excluded and we said, okay, we'll make our way on our own institutions. So in a place like the Black Wall Street in Tulsa, we said, okay, right, you're not going to treat us medically, you're not going to be our lawyers, you're not going to sell us, give us hotel, we'll build our own city.
Mm-hmm.
They created in their own city in Tulsa, the Black Wall Street. Mm-hmm. And what was racist America's reaction to that? They destroyed it.
Mm-hmm.
So every time, we're damned if we do, we're damned if we don't. If we form our own institutions, that create resistance. If we play by their rules and succeed using their standards, like the current Black woman on the Supreme Court, they still say we affirmative action babies. So that the point is that the resistance you see in Philadelphia is not limited to Philadelphia, but it applies across the country. Malcolm X said that the South is below the Canadian border, and we can't forget that.
And that is true.
So the resistance, Michael, you see to inclusion has deeply rooted origins in this country's racist past.
Yes, which, one of the questions that I had for you that we previewed was this notion that it seems on the one hand that primarily because of what happened with George Floyd, that there has been a renewed interest, there has been a kind of a proliferation of new DEI initiatives, particularly in corporate America, et cetera. But at the same time, we're living in a culture that seems more outwardly antagonistic towards African Americans, in particular, people of color more generally, than since in my lifetime. This environment that we find ourselves in is the worst that I've seen it at least since the 80s when Reagan was president. What do you think?
I think your assessment is right. But what I wanted to suggest to you is that if you look at the reaction after the Civil War, and where there was a period of time in which
yes.
Black people were enjoying the benefits of liberation.
Yes.
And the advent or the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, then there came the period called Reconstruction, in which as a part of the so-called Compromise of 1877, all of the federal troops were removed from two key states, South Carolina and Louisiana, which allowed the slave owners to come back to power. Andrew Johnson, who succeeded Lincoln after his assassination,
right.
all of these racists who were slave owners. So there was a backlash to the newly freed slaves in the first Reconstruction.
Right.
So the second Reconstruction, arguably, was the civil rights movement from about 1955 up until about 1968 in the assassination of Martin Luther King. And if you recall, after Brown versus Board of Education in '54, there was a backlash.
Right.
Led by Southern states, but the sentiments against Black people were nationwide.
Right.
At the same time that the South was trying to segregate the schools, you had segregated neighborhoods in Philadelphia up until the present time.
Right.
Some of the most, so the second Reconstruction, I would say, was a reaction to the advances during the Civil Rights Movement, because after 1968, you then got Nixon, and then Reagan, if you think about it. And I think today's problems date not to George Floyd. The reaction you described, the hostility, the overt.
Preach on it now.
It started with Obama.
Yes.
Make no mistake about
yes.
it, that this resistance that you see led to the election of Trump.
Yes.
The covert and overt and latent racism at all levels across all demographics in this country were reflected in the election of Donald Trump. And then after 4 years of this fool, you then have 74 million people who thought this man ought to be president.
That's correct.
So while George Floyd, and it was a wonderful, heartwarming thing to see what happened in the aftermath of the George Floyd killing. The next thing you see, and there were initiatives, like, make no mistake, a lot of people doing soul searching. They were talking about reconciliation movement, like in South Africa. Some people were talking about reparations, which they had no chance of passing.
Right.
So what you see in Ron DeSantis, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Matthew Cawthorn, Gobert, and all of these overt racists. You even have the defensive coordinator for the Washington Command.
Just yesterday,
who described what happened on January 6th as a dust-up.
Yes.
And this guy, but listen, and then compared George Floyd's, the protest, and said, why aren't we looking at that?
Right.
With a team that's primarily comprised of Black players.
Yes.
So these rednecks and racists are emboldened in this particular climate. They really are. It is amazing. So your assessment about how bad things are, I was there in 1964 and 65. I know, I grew up in the Birmingham area. The 16th Street Baptist Church was 10 miles from my house. Freedom rides, the beating with Bull Connor and police dogs of Black protesters. I lived that. And I'm telling you that I feel that the country is in the same state it was after the Civil Rights Movement.
And I think it's really, it's at a tipping point, and I honestly don't know what's going to happen. We have these midterms coming up where the expectation is that the Republicans will take back over the House, if not the Senate. You have, a president, which, I'm glad he's our president, but it's a challenge for him. And so, we're understanding kind of all of that. Where do you see us going? Is it going to get worse before it gets better, or is it just going to get worse and not get better at all?
The hope is that it gets better. And hope springs eternal, for sure. But just think about this. There is a famous Norman Rockwell picture of this Ruby Bridges that shows her integrating this school, I think in New Orleans. It's beautiful young Black girl with pigtails. So you do understand that, and there were angry white mobs shouting at her. You do understand that not only do people want to acknowledge the truth of that, that's why Hannah Nicole Jones had all of that dispute around the 1619
project, right?
Is not only do they not concede the racist past of this country, they don't even want it taught. So they would not even, so that's the climate we're talking about. Far from a reconciliation, there's an unwillingness to admit the atrocities and inhuman treatment of Black people. So, and then you add to that the idea of guns. So, and excessive police force. And they are of the same piece. Police departments.
Oh, yes.
Slave patrol.
Oh, yes.
And the whole debate about guns had to do with the concern that slaves would use the guns as Nat Turner and John Brown and the Stonewall Rebellion in South Carolina proved, that if you put guns in the hands of Black people and you enslave them, they're going to fight back.
That's right.
So my point is the critical race theory foolishness, which says you can't even tell my children that we were a racist country. You can't say we are. You can't even say we were. We are unwilling to acknowledge that we were a racist country. And then what you want to do is you want to take our guns away from us. So no, you can't teach it. and I have a right to have an automatic rifle that disintegrates a person's body. So Michael, I mean, I'm laughing, but I'm not optimistic.
You're laughing to keep from crying because
Yeah.
we find ourselves, we do find ourselves in a very challenging situation, which is why it's interesting. I know in the work that I do on a regular basis, there is still, there's still a lot of companies out there who kind of have taken up this banner of trying to be more diverse, et cetera. And it to me is such a glaring contradiction to what is happening in the world in as a whole, and in our culture in particular. And I'm just interested in how it's going to turn out. I honestly don't know, but I got to tell you, I wouldn't be honest if I didn't say that I fear for my kids and the world that we are kind of leaving them. And I'm the only thing that I can hang my hat on to be hopeful is that there are children, my children, your children, your grandchildren, who have basically lived their lives with people growing up with people from different backgrounds, different races, etc. And so that there is a generation that is coming that will reject this. But again, I don't know what's going to happen, and I'm not hopeful.
Well, one of the things that I try to do every day when I read the newspapers, and I read about 4 newspapers, 5 newspapers every morning, online, of course, is I try to look for a story that is hopeful and optimistic, a feel-good story. I try to look in the newspapers beyond the shootings and the Russians invasion. I try to find a story that gives me a reason for hope and optimism. And to be honest with you, I do find one. I have to dig in deep, and sometimes I burden a weak story with that responsibility to make me feel better about it. But it does, it sustains me. And the thing I don't want to do in this broadcast is leave it on a pessimistic note.
Yes, I agree with that.
Realistic. We can be realistic about that these are in some ways the worst of times, not the best of times.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the things I really want to try to do is offer some, before this is over, some message of optimism. And so I'm reminded, my wife and I, one of the questions that you asked me was, what do I consider to be my greatest success? And it's not professional, it's personal. And it's being fortunate enough to find in college in 1965 and meet the woman who's been my wife for 54 years. But that we were together the night Martin Luther King was assassinated. And she looked at me and said, I don't want to bring children in a world that's filled with such hate. And I thought about that. And you know what? We had children. We have 3 grandchildren. They are delightful. They are talented. So your point, of course, is the same is going to be true of your kids and your grandkids, that we have to make them believe that we have to be realistic and pragmatic about where we are. But we have to tell them that the best of times worst of times don't last forever.
Right.
And we have to find sort of a feel-good story that we can latch on to give us hope. And my last point on that is, 84 million people voted against Trump.
That's true. Now you make an excellent point there.
We can't forget the 80.
That's true.
And they weren't Black people. They weren't all
true.
Black Hispanic people. So when we look at the 74 million people who voted for Trump, let's remember that 84 million people voted against him. And that's where my hope lies, with that 84 million, that hopefully will be 100 million come November.
Well, I will tell you, it's not that you are a former professor, tons of our history. And so, it's interesting, the stuff that I'm doing now, right? My real focus now for Black people in terms of what I do on a day-to-day basis is to have Black businesses to get as much opportunity as they can, so they can in turn provide more opportunity for people of diverse backgrounds, right? That's kind of what I've kind of found myself in, and I've placed myself there in part because I do believe that there is an amount of, I mean, now we're all interrelated, interconnected. So, with that caveat, but there has to be some amount of self-reliance in terms of us having our own businesses, us having our own ability to provide food, not only on our tables, but to help others within our community to do the same. So my what I focus on a day-to-day basis is really equity, right? How do we create opportunities for businesses of color, for women-owned businesses? How do we make sure that they get a fair share of the pie, to the extent that a pie exists that they can where they can eat? And I do that because, in part, because I don't, I mean, I've been in, as you know, Carl, I've been in the political game, and I don't really have a lot of faith in it. I don't have faith in it. I'll just leave it at there. And so, in terms of what Black people should be focused on, if you look at it from a Du Bois versus Washington kind of perspective, where do you think we should be at this particular juncture, given what we've talked about thus far?
Well, I think if you look at what the Black folks in Tulsa did, I mean, we can continue to advocate for equity and inclusion and diversity. And interestingly enough, my wife Rose asked me a couple of days ago, what's the difference between equity and equality? And I said, hell if I know.
Oh,
Maybe
yeah.
maybe I'll know it when I see it. But the question is, what you're doing and what you're talking about has a long history and tradition in this country, that we can seek to be included, to integrate, and we have a right to have full access to
Yes.
opportunities regardless of our race,
Yes.
and our color and our ethnicity. But there is no substitute for building your own institutions. There just isn't. I mean, that Garvey understood that.
Right.
Elijah Muhammad understood that.
Yes.
And they were all flawed. Let's face it, we understand that.
Yes.
But they all understood that you have to do for self. And I think even Leon Sullivan, who used to be the famous pastor of Zion Baptist Church, created Progress Plaza in North Philadelphia. So what you're doing is very much anchored in the history. A.G. Gaston in Birmingham, Alabama, who owned a series of hotels and funeral homes at Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights. All of these are examples of Ida Bay Wells. All of these are examples of people who made a determination. C.J. Walker.
Right.
That, these are our, and so what you're doing is in that tradition, and you can do both.
You can do both, and you should do both.
And looking out for self is sort of your insurance policy for when the diversity fails you.
That's right.
The efforts fail you. So yeah.
That's right. That's right.
And even Booker Washington, whatever you have to say about him, his idea about self-sufficiency and reliance and dignity, apart from the kind of sellout side of all of that, was an important ingredient. Hampton University, strong, like as an example of schools. Bill Harvey built a university down there and increased the endowment. Howard University and the like. So yeah, I think what you're doing is there's a long tradition of Black people doing what you were proposing.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned the universities, because I have not seen it. I guess it's another kind of offshoot of everything that's happening in our culture right now. But I have never seen the amount of attention that HBCUs are getting on a national level that I've seen right now, right? In terms of funds being directed their way, in terms of just highlighting what they do, highlighting how they are able to produce, young people who are, exceptional. Um, in the context of, all of the kind of racist bile that we're seeing currently, to have these institutions not only survive, because I think for many years it was just about survival, but now, at least for some of them, it seems to be more than just survival. They're starting to thrive.
Mhm. Well, I think a few of the sort of more elite HBC
Yes,
are thriving,
yes,
but the smaller ones are struggling.
right.
And it is really hard to make the case and um, for their continued survival, because if somebody has a choice between going to, say, Talladega College that I went to, that was founded in 1867 by descendants of the Amistad Mutiny,
Mhm.
if you had a choice between that school and the University of Pennsylvania or Yale or Temple, not, you know, it's hard to say that going, and I'm a graduate of the HBCU.
Right.
My wife is as well. It's hard to make the case that you're going to have the same opportunities. Now, the problem though is the value of an HBCU for young Black kids. And at the time you go to college, these are formative years. You're deciding what kind of person you're going to be. Your personality, you develop relationships. And probably in hindsight, my regret is that my daughters did not go to HBCU.
Mm-hmm.
One went to Pitt, and the other one went to Yale.
Mm-hmm.
I think that they miss the opportunity to interact in a warm, family, self-realization, actualization, reinforcement environment with other Black people. And that was good for me. And I think young Black people need that. And that's why there's a value, aside from the fact that most of the doctors and lawyers and other professionals
Come from.
come from
That's
HBC.
right. That's right. That's right. But you know what's interesting, which is another reason why I'm doing this work, and it's really because of my own experience, right? Because um, when I had my first firm, the one thing I wanted to do was to provide an environment where young lawyers could grow and develop without fear of, you know, the other.
Mm.
And by that I mean that they could just be themselves and learn the skill, as opposed to being in environments where it oftentimes feels alien and they're concerned about this other stuff besides just learning the skill. And that's another thing I see. I see it with my wife's business, right? She has I think all women employees, but the same thing applies in the sense that it's really just about the work. They don't have to be concerned about dudes and what dudes say or whatever, or the perceptions and all that kind of stuff. All they need to be concerned about is how to make the trains run on time for this organization. And through that process, they learn how to be the best they can be as professionals.
Mm.
And so that's part of what my focus is on all of this stuff, because to me, even if we, the whole point about diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? First of all, diversity is just a fact. We live in a diverse society. Equity is about opportunity. How do we create opportunity for people of color that they can take advantage of? Inclusion is what kind of culture can we create within institutions that are non-diverse to make sure that people from diverse backgrounds feel as if they are included, feel as if they can be who they truly are, as opposed to being somebody else, right? So those are the three things. But my focus is equity, because we can, through these businesses, through these institutions that we create, we can also create these environments where young people in particular can grow and develop and be the best that they can be in the field that they've chosen, right? They can pick up the skill set. I remember, there are only two people that I consider to be true mentors in this legal world, right? One is you, and then the other is John Elliott. And the thing I remember about John Elliott that he always said is, to me as a lawyer, he's like, look, as long as you can pick up the skill set to be able to try a case, then it doesn't really matter whatever else you do. You always have that skill set that you can rely on. And so I took that to heart when I started to mentor younger lawyers to say, look, as long as you are in an environment where you can actually pick up a skill set, once you pick up that skill set, you take that skill set wherever you want to go. You can stay with me, or you can go to blank Rome, or you can do whatever you want to do. But you have to develop that skill set. And I think the thing about Black institutions is that they give you the opportunity to do that without all of that other stuff.
Yeah. Let me react in two ways. One, I want to quickly talk about what you're describing is what Du Bois called the duality,
right,
of Black existence, yes, in society, and in general, you see it in these institutions. So if you're a Black lawyer in a major white law firm, you got to be a Black person, and then you got to balance that with the expectations of what you have to do as a lawyer in a white law firm, and right, that's sort of that competition. But your comment suggested to me what I've said to Joe Tucker about what distinguishes his firm, because I did, as you know, an analysis. We did that CLE a couple of years ago on Black law.
Yes.
And the interesting thing about, and I think it confirms your point, a lot of Black law firms rely on political relationships to get business. Bond work, city contracts, government contracts, so that the success of your practice depends on who
rises and falls on it.
Yep. Absolutely. And my advice in hindsight, and using Joe as an example, Joe Tucker for many years didn't have a clue about the political universe that he had. He was at Morgan, Lewis and Bacchus as an associate and went there to do exactly what you said. Learn how, and John Elliott told you what to do. Learn how to be a good lawyer and try cases. And then if you decide you want to stay in that environment and fight that problem and worry about Du Bois's duality throughout it all, that's good for you.
Right.
And there's a lot of Black lawyers who are doing that, who are surviving, thriving
absolutely
in law firms. On the other hand, there are several who learned how to be good lawyers like Joe and built a practice. So Joe's practice, for the most part, is all about trying cases and defending and representing people.
Right.
And the reality is that if your reputation is that you are tenacious and that you know how to try cases and you win, I'm telling you that people of all colors will come to you.
Correct.
You have a reputation for being that
Correct.
kind of person.
Correct.
If you don't mind, I want to tell you one other story. I got tons of stories, but I know we don't have forever. Years ago, I represented the Philadelphia Tribune in a libel and defamation action filed against them by Frank Rizzo. Rizzo had been the mayor, and then the Tribune had written and he was working at the Philadelphia Gas Works. He had served his 2 terms, and he was term limited, and he was contemplating running for office again after sitting out for 4 years. And so the Tribune started writing a series of articles that were slamming him. So he hired Dick Sprague to represent him in this defamation action. So I take Frank Rizzo's deposition. And during the deposition, Michael, I'm wearing him out. he had a lawyer from Sprague's law firm.
Oh, Sprague didn't defend him?
No, not Sprague himself, but some lawyer whose name I don't remember, but it was the Sprague law firm.
Right.
So during the deposition, I'm wearing him out, asking him questions. And the one thing, whatever you might have thought about Frank Rizzo, he was not a liar. He said what was on his mind. If he thought it, he spoke it.
Right.
So as I was leading him through the deposition, asking him what part of this article was defamatory, he wasn't lying. He wasn't making nothing up. Well, no, that's not true. Is this true? Yeah, that's true. Is this true? Yeah, that's true. So finally, in the middle of the deposition, he said, "What did you say your name was again?" And I told him. He said, "You're a good lawyer." And he said, "Give me your," he said, "Give me your card in the middle of the deposition. Give me one of your cards. I'm going to send you some business." And his lawyer lost his mind, saying, "You can't do this in the middle of the deposition." So I say to him, I'm not doing it. But the moral of the story is we ended up settling the case. And then about 3 months later, my secretary comes in and says to me, "There are 2 white police officers out here to see you." And when Black people hear that police officers are here to see you, you start saying, "What did I do?" Turns out that they had cases, and Frank Rizzo had given my card.
Wow.
So if you want an extreme example of the notion that if you're perceived to be a good lawyer, it can transcend color. And that's the way you get some equity and diversity and some inclusion. Because when the stakes are high, people want somebody who's a warrior, who's knowledgeable, who they know will not be compromised. So you asked me as one of my questions, if I have advice for young lawyers coming up, it would be, you have to accept the duality of your existence in those institutions that are predominantly white and outside of them. Because all of us have walked into a courtroom and been mistaken as the client. As Black lawyers, we were mistaken as the defendants. So, but the good news is that, and I think Joe Tucker's practice, which is why I went back there, given our common sort of origins, I realized that they try cases, and people of all colors, institutions come to him because they know when there's a bet the farm case and the stakes are high, that you got quality representation. And that's what young lawyers like yourself and others strive to do. You want to learn the best that you can about your craft and get the word out that you know what you're doing and you're not going to take no nonsense and you're going to fight and ride or die with that client.
Carl Singley, thank you for being on the show today, my friend. It has been, I knew we weren't going to have enough time. There's so much stuff to talk about. So I am going to say to you, I hope that at some point in the very near future, we can have you back on to continue this conversation, because to me, this is a very important conversation.
Well, I've enjoyed it, Mike. It's always good to reconnect.
Yes.
Get my best to the family.
Thank you very much. And audience, thank you for being a part of our show. We look forward to continuing the discussion and keeping it going. Until next time.